March 9, 1945. 17:48 hours Guam. Major General Curtis LeMay stood in the operations center of the 21st Bomber Command, studying weather reports that would determine the fate of Tokyo. B-29 superfortresses sat outside, 334. Boeing on the path to this moment had begun 18 months earlier, when the first B-29s arrived in the China-Burma-India theater, carrying promises of precision bombing that would cripple Japanese industry without massive civilian casualties. American doctrine emphasized daylight precision attacks against military and industrial targets. Bombardiers trained to place bombs within circular error probable zones measured in hundreds of feet. The Norden bomb site, America's most closely guarded military secret, could allegedly drop bombs into pickle barrels from 20,000 feet. This was civilized warfare, surgical strikes that would destroy enemy capability while minimizing collateral damage. But 18 months of operations had proven that daylight precision bombing against Japan was a catastrophic failure. High-altitude attacks from 25,000 feet encountered jet stream winds exceeding 200 miles per hour that scattered bomb patterns across miles of territory. Weather over Japan was consistently terrible, with cloud cover obscuring targets for weeks at a time. Japanese fighter defenses, while limited in number, proved devastatingly effective against formations flying predictable courses at constant altitudes. Most critically, the industrial targets American planners had identified were dispersed throughout residential areas in a pattern that made precision attacks nearly impossible. The statistics told the story of futility. In 22 major daylight raids between November 1944 and March 1945, B-29s dropped 7,180 tons of bombs on Japanese targets. Reconnaissance photos revealed that less than 10% of designated aim points had been hit. Aircraft production continued. Steel production remained steady. Oil refinery capacity was barely affected. The precision bombing campaign was achieving nothing except the loss of irreplaceable aircraft and crews. Major General Haywood Hansell, LeMay's predecessor commanding the 21st Bomber Command, had clung to precision doctrine despite mounting evidence of its failure. Hansell was a true believer in daylight bombing, one of the architects of American strategic bombing theory developed during the 1930s. He insisted that high-altitude precision attacks would eventually succeed once tactics were refined and crew training improved. But by January 1945, losses were mounting while results remained negligible. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, made the decision to replace Hansell with Curtis LeMay, a commander who had demonstrated willingness to adapt tactics based on combat realities rather than theoretical doctrine. LeMay arrived in the Marianas with a reputation forged over the skies of Europe. He had commanded the 305th Bomb Group during the devastating raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt, missions that cost the 8th Air Force hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crew members. He had developed the combat box formation that allowed bomber streams to concentrate defensive firepower while maintaining bombing accuracy. He had pioneered lead crew techniques that improved bombing precision under combat conditions. Most importantly, he had demonstrated complete ruthlessness in pursuing mission objectives regardless of cost. The new commander spent his first weeks in the Pacific analyzing everything his predecessors had done wrong. He studied weather patterns, target reconnaissance, crew training records, maintenance statistics, and loss rates. He interviewed pilots, bombardiers, and intelligence officers. He examined captured Japanese documents and interrogated prisoners. His conclusions were stark and undeniable. Daylight precision bombing was not working and would never work under the conditions that existed over Japan. LeMay's analysis revealed multiple factors that made precision attacks impossible. The jet stream over Japan created wind conditions that no bombardier could compensate for at high altitude. Japanese weather patterns produced cloud cover that obscured targets more than 70% of the time. The industrial targets themselves were integrated into residential areas in ways that made precision bombing meaningless. Most critically, Japanese industry had been dispersed into small workshops throughout urban areas, creating thousands of targets that precision bombing could never address systematically. But LeMay also identified an opportunity that previous commanders had ignored. Japanese cities were uniquely vulnerable to fire. Unlike European cities built with stone, brick, and concrete, Japanese urban areas consisted primarily of wooden structures with paper walls and thatched roofs. Population density in cities like Tokyo exceeded 100,000 people per square mile, creating conditions where fires would spread rapidly across vast areas. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese firefighting capabilities were primitive, with limited water supplies and equipment designed for small structural fires rather than area conflagrations. The solution was obvious, but required abandoning every principle of American strategic bombing doctrine. Instead of precision attacks against specific targets, LeMay would conduct area attacks designed to burn entire cities. Instead of daylight raids that maximized bombing accuracy, he would attack at night when Japanese fighter defenses were weakest. Instead of high-altitude bombing that avoided anti-aircraft fire, his aircraft would attack from 5,000 to 8,000 feet, where bombing accuracy improved dramatically, but exposure to ground fire increased proportionally. Most controversially, LeMay decided to remove defensive armament from his B-29s. The massive aircraft carried 12 machine guns in remote-controlled turrets operated by gunners positioned throughout the fuselage. The weapon systems added substantial weight while requiring crew members whose primary function was defensive rather than offensive. For night attacks against limited fighter opposition, LeMay calculated that defensive guns were unnecessary weight that reduced bomb loads and fuel capacity. The decision to strip defensive armament was unprecedented in American bombing operations. Every previous mission had emphasized heavily armed formations, capable way to targets and of fighting their back. Bomber crews had trained extensively in defensive tactics, gunnery procedures, and formation flying techniques designed to maximize mutual protection. LeMay was asking crews to fly into combat, essentially defenseless, trusting that darkness and surprise would provide protection that machine guns could not. The weapon that would make area attacks possible was the M69 incendiary bomb, a 6-pound device filled with napalm gel that would ignite on impact and burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Each B-29 would carry 1,520 of these weapons clustered in 38-pound containers that would open at predetermined altitudes, scattering individual firebombs across target areas. The mathematics were terrifying. A single aircraft could distribute firebombs across an area measuring 2,000 by 500 feet. A formation of 300 aircraft could blanket 100 square miles with incendiary devices that would ignite simultaneously, creating fires that would merge into unstoppable conflagrations. LeMay understood the implications of what he was planning. This would not be precision bombing against military targets. This would be area bombing designed to destroy entire sections of cities, along with everyone living in them. The civilian casualties would be massive and undeniable. The precedent would fundamentally change how strategic bombing was conducted for the remainder of the war and beyond. But conventional precision bombing had failed completely, and LeMay was convinced that only shock tactics could force Japanese surrender before a costly invasion became necessary. On March 8th, LeMay briefed his wing commanders on the new tactics. The primary target would be Tokyo, specifically a 12-square-mile area in the eastern part of the city, where industrial facilities were integrated with dense residential neighborhoods. The attack would commence after midnight, when winds were typically lightest and Japanese fighter activity was minimal. Aircraft would attack individually rather than in formation, approaching from different directions at varying altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. The goal was not to hit specific factories or military installations. The goal was to burn everything within the target area so completely that reconstruction would be impossible. The briefing room fell silent as LeMay outlined the tactical details that would govern the night's operations. Lead aircraft would drop strings of incendiaries to mark the target boundaries, creating a box of fire that subsequent waves would fill systematically. Each bombardier would aim for gaps between existing fires, ensuring complete coverage across the designated area. The interval between aircraft would be reduced to 30 seconds over target, compressing the attack into the shortest possible time frame to overwhelm Japanese firefighting capabilities before they could organize effective responses. Wing commanders raised immediate concerns about the fundamental changes to established procedures. Colonel Thomas Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing questioned the wisdom of removing defensive armament entirely. His crews had trained for months in formation flying and mutual protection tactics. Colonel John Davies of the 313th expressed reservations about low-altitude attacks that would expose aircraft to anti-aircraft fire that high-altitude missions could avoid. Colonel Carl Story of the 315th worried about navigation challenges during individual approaches rather than formation flying that provided mutual navigation assistance. LeMay addressed each concern with characteristic directness. Japanese fighter strength had been reduced to fewer than 300 operational aircraft across the entire home islands. Night fighter capability was virtually non-existent. The Imperial Navy's remaining carriers were bottled up in port or had been sunk. Ground-based interceptors lacked radar guidance for night operations and would be operating blind in darkness and smoke. The mathematical probability of fighter interception during individual night attacks was negligible compared to daylight formation raids that provided Japanese controllers with predictable targets. Anti-aircraft defenses around Tokyo were substantial, but concentrated around specific high-value targets like the Imperial Palace, government buildings, and major industrial complexes. The residential areas designated for attack had minimal anti-aircraft coverage. More importantly, Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine emphasized high-altitude interception designed to counter daylight precision attacks. Gun crews were trained to engage formations at 20,000 feet or higher. Low-altitude night attacks would present targeting problems that Japanese gunners had never trained to solve. Navigation concerns were addressed through detailed route planning that utilized geographic features visible even in darkness. The approach would follow the coast of Honshu Island northward, providing continuous navigational reference points. Tokyo Bay offered an unmistakable landmark visible from 50 miles away. The target area itself bordered the Sumida River, creating a natural boundary that bombardiers could identify visually. Individual aircraft approaches would reduce the navigation precision required compared to formation flying where timing and positioning had to be coordinated among hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. The weapons load configuration represented a complete departure from previous operations. Each B-29 would carry 7 tons of M69 incendiary clusters, the maximum possible load with fuel requirements for the 1,500-mile round-trip mission. Defensive ammunition would be removed entirely, except for tail gunner positions that would retain limited ammunition for emergency situations. The weight savings would increase bomb load capacity by nearly 2,000 pounds per aircraft, while improving fuel efficiency for the long overwater flight. Crew assignments reflected the tactical changes. Bombardiers would assume primary responsibility for target identification and weapon release without the complex coordination procedures required for formation bombing. Navigators would plot individual routes rather than formation tracks. Pilots would fly alone rather than maintaining position within bomber streams. Radio operators would maintain strict silence except for emergency situations. The entire crew structure was simplified to support individual aircraft operations rather than coordinated formation attacks. Weather analysis indicated optimal conditions for the planned attack. High-pressure systems over the Pacific would create stable atmospheric conditions with minimal turbulence at low altitudes. Wind speeds over Tokyo were forecast at less than 15 miles per hour, ideal for fire spread, but not strong enough to scatter incendiary patterns beyond target boundaries. Cloud cover would be minimal, providing clear visibility for target identification, while maintaining darkness that would conceal approaching aircraft from visual observation. Intelligence estimates of Japanese defensive capabilities painted a picture of declining effectiveness. Radar coverage around Tokyo was limited to older equipment with poor low-altitude detection capability. Fighter strength had been reduced by months of attrition, fighting against American carrier raids and long-range escort missions. Pilot quality had deteriorated as experienced aviators were killed and replaced by hastily trained replacements with minimal flight time. Anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed due to raw material shortages that affected all aspects of Japanese military production. The target selection reflected careful analysis of Tokyo's industrial structure and vulnerability patterns. The designated area contained approximately 200 small manufacturing facilities producing aircraft components, electronics, precision instruments, and other military supplies. But more significantly, it housed nearly 750,000 civilians in wooden structures that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The population density exceeded any urban area in Europe or America, creating conditions where fires would spread through interconnected neighborhoods faster than residents could evacuate. LeMay's planners had studied the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, when fires following the seismic event had killed more than 100,000 people in Tokyo and surrounding areas. The fire spread patterns from that disaster provided templates for predicting how incendiary attacks would develop. Narrow streets and closely spaced buildings would channel flames while preventing effective firefighting access. Wooden construction would provide continuous fuel for fires that would reach temperatures hot enough to create their own weather systems through thermal updrafts. The psychological impact was calculated as carefully as the physical destruction. Japanese morale had been sustained throughout the war by beliefs that the home islands remained inviolate, protected by distance and defensive strength that would make invasion costly beyond American willingness to sustain. Massive urban fires visible for hundreds of miles would shatter those beliefs while demonstrating American capability to reach any target in Japan. The shock effect of seeing major cities burning would undermine civilian support for continued resistance more effectively than precision attacks against industrial targets that most civilians never saw. Mission timing was set for departure after 1800 hours on March 9th, with arrivals over target beginning after midnight local time. The interval between takeoff and target approach would provide several hours of darkness for the overwater flight, while ensuring that attacks commenced during the early morning hours when Japanese defensive readiness would be at its lowest point. Night shift workers would be heading home, while day shift workers had not yet reported for duty, creating optimal conditions for achieving surprise. Final preparations included modifications to aircraft systems that had never been tested under combat conditions. Bomb bay doors were adjusted for rapid opening and closing to minimize exposure time over targets. Navigation equipment was calibrated for low-altitude operations rather than the high-altitude missions for which the aircraft had been designed. Communication systems were set for minimal transmission to maintain operational security throughout the mission. As crews completed their final equipment checks, the magnitude of what they were attempting became clear to everyone involved. This was not merely a tactical innovation or an operational experiment. This was a fundamental rejection of everything American strategic bombing had represented since the first B-17 crossed the English Channel in 1942. The precision instruments that had defined American air power would be replaced by incendiary weapons designed to create indiscriminate destruction. The daylight formations that had symbolized American technological superiority would give way to individual night attacks that relied on stealth rather than defensive firepower. Flight engineers conducted final inspections of aircraft systems that would operate under conditions no manufacturer had envisioned. The Wright R3350 engines that powered each B-29 had been designed for high-altitude operations, where thin air and cold temperatures provided optimal performance characteristics. At the altitudes LeMay planned to attack, these engines would operate in dense air that increased fuel consumption while reducing power output. Engine temperatures would rise beyond normal parameters, requiring careful monitoring to prevent mechanical failures that could force crews to abort missions or crash before reaching friendly territory. Fuel calculations revealed the narrow margins that governed the entire operation. Each aircraft would carry maximum fuel loads to enable the 1,500-mile round-trip mission, but the additional weight of full tanks combined with maximum bomb loads would stress aircraft systems beyond their designed limits. Takeoff rolls would be extended far beyond normal parameters, requiring every foot of runway available on the coral strips that American engineers had carved from Pacific Islands. Any mechanical problem during takeoff would likely prove catastrophic, as heavily loaded aircraft would lack the performance margins necessary for emergency procedures. The psychological preparation of crews presented challenges that no previous mission had required. Bombardiers trained in precision targeting would be asked to aim at residential neighborhoods filled with civilians who posed no direct military threat. Pilots accustomed to flying in protective formations would operate alone over hostile territory, without the mutual support that had sustained bomber operations throughout the European campaign. Gunners who had spent months learning to coordinate defensive fire would sit at positions stripped of weapons, helpless against any opposition they might encounter. Group chaplains conducted services for crews who requested spiritual guidance before departing on missions that many recognized might require them to act in ways that challenged their moral foundations. The distinction between military and civilian targets that had governed American bombing doctrine would disappear entirely over Tokyo. The weapons being loaded into bomb bays were designed to kill anyone within their blast radius, regardless of age, gender, or involvement in the war effort. Some crew members struggled with the implications, while others accepted the mission as necessary to end a conflict that had already cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Intelligence briefings provided final updates on Japanese defensive preparations that revealed both opportunities and dangers for the approaching attack. Reconnaissance flights had identified increased anti-aircraft gun positions around key industrial areas, but these weapons remained concentrated in locations that would not affect the residential targets selected for the night's mission. Japanese fighter strength appeared unchanged from previous estimates, with most operational aircraft positioned at bases too distant from Tokyo to respond effectively to night attacks. Most significantly, radio intercepts indicated no awareness among Japanese commanders that American tactics were about to change fundamentally. Weather reconnaissance aircraft departing ahead of the main formation confirmed optimal conditions over the target area. Cloud cover remained minimal throughout the flight path, with visibility exceeding 10 miles at planned attack altitudes. Wind speeds over Tokyo measured less than 12 miles per hour from the southwest, creating ideal conditions for fire spread, while remaining light enough to prevent bomb pattern dispersion beyond acceptable limits. Temperature and humidity readings indicated atmospheric conditions that would support rapid fire development once incendiary devices began functioning. The departure sequence began precisely on schedule as engines started throughout the 3 airfields that would launch the attack. Mechanics made final adjustments to aircraft systems, while armament crews completed loading procedures for weapons that most ground personnel had never handled previously. The M69 incendiary clusters required specialized handling techniques because the napalm gel inside individual bomblets remained volatile throughout all phases of preparation and loading. Safety procedures developed specifically for this mission governed every aspect of weapons handling from storage through final arming sequences. Aircraft began taxiing toward takeoff positions in a choreographed sequence that would space departures at precise intervals designed to optimize fuel consumption and arrival timing over target areas. The heavily loaded B-29s moved slowly along taxiways that had been reinforced to handle weights exceeding original design specifications. Ground crews monitored tire pressures and landing gear systems that were operating under stress levels that would have been considered dangerous during normal operations. First aircraft departed Guam at exactly 18:05 hours, with Colonel Power's 314th Bombardment Wing leading the initial wave. The B-29s climbed slowly due to maximum fuel and bomb loads that prevented normal ascent rates. Full power settings were maintained longer than usual to achieve cruising altitude, increasing engine temperatures while consuming fuel at rates that left minimal reserves for unexpected contingencies. Navigation systems were set for the individual flight paths that would bring each aircraft to Tokyo from different directions at carefully calculated intervals. Radio silence was maintained from the moment of departure, creating an eerie quiet in cockpits accustomed to constant communication during formation flying. Pilots monitored engine parameters, while navigators plotted courses using dead reckoning techniques that had been standard during the early years of aviation, but had been largely superseded by radio navigation aids. The absence of external communication forced crews to rely entirely on their own skills and equipment for successful mission completion. As the first B-29s disappeared into gathering darkness over the Pacific, ground crews began preparing subsequent waves that would maintain the attack throughout the early morning hours. Fuel trucks moved between aircraft, while ammunition handling teams loaded incendiary clusters with mechanical precision that concealed the nervous tension affecting everyone involved in the operation. Intelligence officers monitored radio frequencies for any indication that Japanese forces had detected the departing formations or anticipated the nature of the approaching attack. Meteorological data continued to confirm optimal conditions throughout the projected flight path and target area. High-pressure systems over the Western Pacific would provide stable weather conditions that would persist through the attack window. Ocean temperatures remained warm enough to prevent icing conditions that could affect aircraft systems during the low-altitude over-water flight. Most importantly, atmospheric conditions over Tokyo would support fire development while preventing wind patterns that could drive flames beyond the designated target boundaries. The final briefings emphasized timing sequences that would determine mission success or failure. Lead aircraft would arrive over Tokyo at approximately 00:15 hours local time, dropping marker incendiaries to establish target boundaries for subsequent waves. Follow-up aircraft would arrive at 30-second intervals, filling the marked area with additional incendiary clusters that would create overlapping fire patterns. The compressed timing was essential to overwhelm Japanese firefighting capabilities before organized responses could develop, but it also increased collision risks as hundreds of aircraft converged on the same target area from multiple directions in darkness. Navigation checkpoints along the route provided reference points for individual aircraft flying without formation support for the first time in their combat careers. The island of Iwo Jima, recently captured after costly fighting, would serve as the primary navigation reference for course corrections during the overwater flight. From Iwo Jima, crews would follow compass headings that would bring them to the Japanese coast at predetermined points that would distribute the approaching aircraft across multiple approach routes to prevent concentration that Japanese defenders might detect and counter. As darkness settled completely over the Pacific, the full scope of what was unfolding became apparent to commanders and crews alike. 334 B-29 superfortresses were converging on Tokyo from bases scattered across 1,500 miles of ocean, each carrying 7 tons of incendiary weapons designed to create fires that would consume everything within a 12-square-mile area of the world's largest city. The attack would introduce tactics that abandoned every principle of precision bombing while embracing area destruction as a legitimate strategic objective. The lead aircraft crossed the Japanese coastline at exactly 1200 hours, their right R-3350 engines throttled back to reduce noise signatures that might alert coastal observers. Below them, the lights of Tokyo spread across the Kanto Plain like a constellation fallen to earth, the city's blackout regulations proving ineffective against the illumination required for essential wartime production. Navigator Lieutenant Robert Rhodes, flying in the lead Pathfinder aircraft, identified the distinctive bend of the Sumida River that marked the eastern boundary of their target area. The residential districts below showed no indication that anyone suspected what was approaching from the darkness above. Colonel Thomas Power, commanding the 314th Bombardment Wing from the lead aircraft, activated the bomb bay doors as his bombardier aligned the Norden bomb sight on the predetermined release point. The mechanical precision of the bomb sight seemed almost absurd given their mission parameters. Instead of aiming at a specific factory or military installation, they were targeting an intersection of residential streets where 150,000 people lived in wooden houses that had stood largely unchanged since the Meiji Restoration. The irony was not lost on crews who had spent months training to place bombs within circular error probable zones measured in feet, only to find themselves scattering incendiaries across areas measured in square miles. The firestorm that engulfed Tokyo that night killed more than 100,000 civilians and destroyed 267,000 buildings across 16 square miles. LeMay's tactical revolution had succeeded beyond all projections, proving that area bombing could achieve results that precision attacks never could. But the flames that consumed Japan's capital also consumed the moral certainties that had governed American strategic doctrine since the war began. The night of March 9th marked the moment when military necessity overwhelmed humanitarian constraints, establishing precedents that would echo through every conflict that followed.